This year we're reflecting on 50 years of transplantation at the University Hospital and the innovation that it was at the time, giving back people good quality of life.
I'm Dr. Rex Boak. I graduated from the Faculty of Medicine in 1961. I interned and took a year of my residency at the Royal Alec Hospital, and then in 1963 came to the University of Alberta Hospital and entered the urology training program. At the end of my training, I went to Los Angeles as a R. Samuel McLaughlin traveling fellowship that paid your part of your way down with the idea that you come back to the original center. Up to 1967, there were probably 50 transplants done in North America. 1967 was the first of the immunosuppressive drugs that came out, and renal transplantation just sort of exploded at that time. In 1967, we did 50 transplants. We kept track of all of those because the person that did the tissue typing for matching of the kidney and the recipient was in our hospital at UCLA. So the blood would be sent from these other centers, so we knew exactly who was being transplanted at what time all over the place. And that was, even when I came back, we were sending blood samples down for typing until we got our own typing facilities and program going here.
Dr. Ray Ulan, come originally from Mundare, Alberta, sausage country. I didn't really know what to do, so I went into dentistry. That was my dad's idea, actually. That didn't work out, and I then ended up in medicine. Same class as Rex. We interned at the Royal Alec as well, so that was a good year. After graduation from medicine and after doing the internship, again, in a quandary what to do. But during the summer of the internship, I visited Lionel MacLeod several times. Got to know him from medical school, and he really was what I thought was a great physician, a great human being, and he was my role model and a mentor. So that's basically why I got into nephrology, Lionel MacLeod. And he started the program here, he started the program in Calgary, and he ended up being the first president of AHFMR. I got my fellowship in 1966. And then went on staff in 1967 in the summer after July 1st. In the first year when I was doing the renal service, and I did that even before starting internal medicine, the patient population was very different. The relationship with the staff was different. It was obvious that things were going to happen. This was the right course to take, and that we were on the verge of something great. In the end, they were right.
My name is Shirley Lakey. I'm the wife of Dr. William Hall Lakey, and we were married for 57 wonderful, exciting years. We were married just before my husband went to Boston. Bill had finished a surgical residency with Dr. Walter McKenzie. It was a huge influence in Bill's life and in mine subsequently, and in fact, all of the University of Alberta surgical residents. He was exceptional in so many ways, and he had an international reputation, and he really believed in research. And so, as a student in surgery, there was a lot of research happening, and Bill did win the Canadian Award for some research at that time. Bill showed an interest in transplantation through his research, and Dr. McKenzie had the ability to pick up the phone and call his colleagues wherever they might be, and he phoned Boston to Hartwell Harrison and Joe Murray, and they took Bill there for a period of time. He then went on with Dr. Reed Nesbitt at the University of Michigan. We went on to come back with Dr. McKenzie's insistence, as you mentioned. Part of the decision is you will come back, and he became the first full-time surgical professor. He practiced with Rex throughout many years, and they've had a wonderful relationship. I do remember the night calls throughout life, though, and how even the children would know that this kidney that was going to be transplanted was placed on ice, and therefore it was quite pale looking. And as soon as it was connected, it became pink and the urine started to flow. It wouldn't matter what night, that's the story I would get when he came home. The motivation for the transplantation obviously are these ill patients that Bill was able to see on dialysis because he would put the cannulas in. And he used to say that, these people were 2 or 3 or 4 times a week, 4 hours at a time, and a kidney transplant was a hope for them. And that's the motivation, I'm sure, still for you, to get these people back to a normal life.
Dialysis was the start of a need for transplantation and innovation. Ray, you were there when the first dialysis was done.
The first dialysis was December 21st, 1962. Actually, another patient from Alberta in October of that same year went into a serious level of renal failure, and he had to be taken to Seattle to be started on dialysis. So he was actually the first Alberta patient to be on dialysis. The patient that started dialysis in Edmonton at the U of A was a referral from Calgary. 17-year-old girl. She had reflux nephropathy. She was in terminal uremia with seizures, that sort of thing. At that time, we did not have the equipment. So calls went between Lionel McLeod and Belding Scribner. The machinery was shipped that night on an airplane, and we got it. The company that made the equipment was Sweden Freezer, an ice cream manufacturing company or equipment manufacturing company in Seattle. It required assembly. There was instruction sheets with the whole thing, so we spent part of one night doing that. So she had her first run, and the first run was 12 hours. And in general, at that time, when they were started on the therapy, it was 12 hours twice a week. That clearly was inadequate, and slowly over time that was increased as the dialysis got more efficient and blood flows could be increased. In the beginning, the patients going for transplant were much more uremic than what they are now, and it's been a progression of improvement ever since then.
Who decided who got dialysis? You mentioned about the acute kidney injury, but long-term dialysis, and once they've solved some of the problems with the shunts?
The criteria at that time was that you had to be without any comorbidities such as diabetes, any other significant medical complications, you were excluded. You should be able to be trained to do part of the treatment and to take your medications, follow diet. So the criteria were very restricted. And most of the early transplant patients coming out of this pool then were in the 30s, 40s, rarely over the age of 45.
So Rex, I mean, there is obviously a need for a better way. Dialysis was hard to come by with machines and infection, and it was pretty limited. So what did transplantation offer these people?
It was kind of difficult because neither the dialysis was as successful as they wanted it to be, and the same thing with the transplantation. And our results of kidney transplantation weren't as good as they are now or as good as we wanted them to be. And in kind of bragging about it, it wasn't the surgical technique that was the problem, it was the fact that the kidneys were being rejected.
In the first year, there was five transplants done. When I look at them, the sheets that Bill kept on them, people didn't live very long with their transplant in the first year. It's a pretty scary fact to undergo a big operation. And what sort of complications were seen?
Well, we were experimenting with immunosuppression at that time, and the azathioprine had been introduced, but we didn't know how to use it because it knocked all of your immune responses out. And the main drug was prednisone. So we loaded up and bloated up all of these people with all kinds of prednisone, which was only a temporary thing because they could only take that so long. And Eventually, we weren't controlling the rejection as well as we should, basically because we weren't doing good tissue typing to select the right patients.
Do you have a criteria?
Yes, it was Dr. Lakey and Dr. McLeod, Dr. Hewlin, and probably me would kind of make a decision on who needed it the most after whatever crude tissue typing we would do. So that would select the group down to just a few. One of the things that Dr. Lakey was very involved and innovated with was a kidney perfusion machine, so that we could harvest the kidneys and put it on the kidney perfusion machine for up to a couple of days at that time and do some better tissue typing. One time we had a kidney that there wasn't anyone in our whole program that could be a suitable recipient. What we did was we got a furniture truck, put the kidney perfusion machine, took it out to the airport, and they flew this machine in a big cargo plane to Saskatoon, where they transplanted the kidney. So that was kind of a fun thing.
The donors in that, where did they come from? Who approached the people to donate kidneys in the early days?
That was always a problem. Our main source was neurosurgery, because the patients were brain dead, and the person who sort of did all of the work was Pauline McCormick, because she was the coordinator between seeing who the kidneys, where they were coming from, and then getting permission and doing all this to make the kidneys available.
Initially, and certainly that was the case in 1967, what was necessary was matching of the blood groups and a negative cross-match. HLA, we didn't do at that time. That came later with the John Dossiter lab and the program that he set up. The treatment was prednisone, Imuran, and some irradiation. Some were irradiated, but not that many.
My name is Frances Harley. I'm from Ontario, and I took a BA at Smith College in the United States and came back to the University of Western Ontario to get my medical degree, graduating in 1965. I got married in med school, and I trained in Baltimore in pediatrics, and then we went to the Montreal area, and I was at the Montreal Children's, where ultimately I was the metabolic resident. So the metabolic resident in the Montreal Children's handled diabetes, cystic fibrosis, and kidney disease. And that's really where I got my interest in kidney disease, but it even started earlier, because I was having a lot of trouble with the loop of Henle and understanding all the physiology. And I thought after that, if I'm going through all this, I better make something of it. We left Montreal. We came here, and my husband promised me, he said, "Frances, it's only for a year. Look who's still here." And my first job happened because there was a bone marrow transplant on this infectious disease ward. A lot of the high-minded intellectuals were sort of arguing with each other. George Golsand said to me, "Your job is to keep these doctors from fighting." And I worked with Kelvin Betcher then, who's a well-known nephrologist here. He was very supportive. Here I was coming from pediatrics. I was a fully trained pediatric person when I got here. And then I joined the nephrology fellowship program and kind of stayed on. There were children with kidney disease, but the diagnosis, for example, of hemolytic uremic syndrome had never been made before I came. And I don't know what happened to people really children who were in renal failure. But I think the most amazing thing to me coming here was the attitude of John Dossiter. At the Children's Hospital in Montreal, if you had end-stage renal failure, that was it. I actually, as the resident, apparently by mistake, had referred a patient up to the Montreal General for a kidney transplant. And I was told that this was the first patient that had ever been referred up. So there was this feeling that children should not have extended lives with either dialysis or transplant. So when I got here, John Dossiter more or less said, well, children are equal. They will be treated the same. You will be treated the same. Get busy. We had some firsts, for sure. One of the ones that I was just delighted with, I had read a paper about the parents being live donor transplants to their child with cystinosis. So I sent my first cystinosis patient to Seattle, where I knew they had a backup dialysis program, and the surgeon who had first done the surgery accomplished it on a patient of ours whose wedding I went to. So that was pretty thrilling. And I think the reason in some ways it was a benefit to pediatric nephrology to be in Edmonton, sort of far from everywhere, because it forced you at national meetings to go out and meet people. And I was lucky enough to have 3 short sabbaticals at the University of California, San Francisco, where I saw what different kinds of surgery could be done between adults, huge kidneys, and little kids. And in addition, I was no longer adapting adult dialysis to pediatrics. I saw a real pediatric unit with the nutritionist and the social worker. So having those connections actually helped a lot.
We heard that access was a real difficult problem to dialyze even adults. How was that approached in the pediatric population?
We had problems too. And eventually we used cannulas, and I became reasonably expert at this declotting procedure, where you use this horrible instrument called the clot screw. I could not have done this by myself for 20 years if I hadn't had Richard Greinick. There was one child I was sure was going to die on dialysis if he didn't get a transplant. And so I made the father come in and watch the declotting procedure, and he stepped up. And then a partner joined, Dr. Verna Yu, about 20 years later. Kidneys were distributed differently in the United States. Children, I wouldn't say they got first chance at a kidney, but they were certainly high on the list. That was not the case here. I don't know if Phil Halloran will remember when Verna got up and gave the numbers in the United States, but there was a lot of resistance to that because youth likes to experiment with drugs. I mean, a little less prednisone, a little more prednisone. So even though it's risky, maybe the kidney won't last forever, I think children do very well in terms of keeping their kidney long term.
They are prioritized in our program now to receive, good organs and to be transplanted because of the ability to grow and develop, sharper minds. You see people that aren't transplanted, they're shorter, they haven't succeeded as well, so.
Well, I think when I trained, the thought of keeping a child on a program like that for years and years was meant to some people that it's not a real life, and that it maybe should end earlier rather than stretching out a handicapped life forever. I mean, that's what was so different when I came here, that John didn't see it that way. And he said, as he said, go for it. Well, 1986 was a wonderful year when cyclosporin came along. Do you remember we were the primary investigators for cyclosporin? We were given that title, like we were really investigating, right? But we got to all the meetings. And we were the primary investigators at this site. I had a very good relationship with Minneapolis, and there was a direct flight, from Edmonton to Minneapolis, and there was a surgeon there by the name of Nigerian, and he was willing to take our children. But I have to say, the government was willing to pay for it. I remember actually sending one young patient, a First Nations patient, with her little igloo box and her kidney down there. I didn't go with her on that occasion, but on occasion I would go with the patient, the box. So it was amazing what these igloo boxes, kidneys sitting on ice could do.
Also just want to mention that we totally support what Francis says about Richard Greenock. The guy is absolutely fabulous. In terms of access, I think he's been the best in the world. And we're very lucky to have him. And I hope Richard is at the gala and sees a clip regarding the things that have been said about him.
My name is Freda Ainley. I was born in the United Kingdom, moved to Canada in 1965, first to Ontario, then to Manitoba, and then in 1969 moved on to Alberta. Actually, I was always sick as a girl. Mum never knew what was wrong, and doctors in Britain at that time didn't know either. After arriving in Edmonton, it seemed like all of a sudden, as soon as I put my feet on Alberta soil, I became ill. 1970, my family physician had some tests done on me, and within 24 hours admitted me to the Royal Alec Hospital. More tests were done, and then I was sent over to the University of Alberta Hospital to see Dr. John Dossiter, who, of course, I was told was a nephrologist. I was a very sick lady. I was asked to put on a hospital gown, and I was just too weak to do it. But fortunately, Dr. Harley, she so kindly helped me to get my gown on, and Dr. Harley and I have been friends ever since. Just such a small little thing, but such a big thing to me. Nobody told me what dialysis was about, but I was taken to the surgical suite one day to have a shunt, or a fistula as they called it then, put in my left leg. But 2 days later, not even a chance for it to heal properly, I was taken to the dialysis unit at the time. I was scared to death. I cried for my mum. However, Dr. Hewlin took care of me, like many of the other doctors at the renal unit. Transplants were not very successful. And when Dr. Hewlin called me in April of 1972 to tell me that there was a kidney that they thought was a good match, and basically after some conversation, I basically said, I'm scared. I haven't seen anybody that's successful, and I have a little girl to look after, and she was very important to me and had no family here to help me, look after her. I didn't use the word, but I almost said no to it. And then I sat down and talked to Gillian, my daughter, and she said, that was Dr. Hewlin, wasn't it? And they've got a kidney for you, haven't they? And I said, yes, they do. And she said, Mummy, you won't be like the others. You're not like the others. You'll be all right. So I called Dr. Hewlin back, and I think it was after 10 o'clock at night, and said to him, is that kidney still available? And he said, why? And I said, Gillian would like me to accept. And I said, I'll have a go. I never said yes. Those were the words. I just said, I'll have a go. April 14th, 1972, at 8 a.m., I received a new kidney. Is 45 years later, I'm sitting here talking to you with a smile on my face. It has been a good ride, a very good ride, and I appreciate every moment that I take a breath.
That's a great story, and from my understanding, you're probably the oldest surviving deceased donor kidney in North America at 45 years.
My name is Pauline McCormick. I was born in Liverpool, England, and I came to Canada in 1967. So I'm celebrating my 50 years of being in Canada and a true Canadian. I was very young when I first came to Canada, and I was on an adventure. Life was good. Life was going to show me the world. My training was excellent, and I could go anywhere in the world. But I chose Edmonton. I chose the University of Alberta. I came alone. People thought I was absolutely crazy. My poor father thought he'd never see me again. But I did promise him I was only coming for a year. That year has lasted 50. I worked at the Royal Alexandra Hospital in the intensive care unit, and it was then that I had a feeling for what was this dialysis all about. So I thought, I have to learn about this dialysis. I have to find out why it's so special. So I applied for a job. I got it on MP5 in the Melbourne Pavilion, where the hemodialysis was done. That was in about, I think, 1972, 1973. More and more patients were being admitted for dialysis treatments. And we were doing very few kidney transplants in those days. But it really bothered me that, you know, people were coming to dialysis and they were going to remain on dialysis for the rest of their lives if they didn't get a transplant. Enough emotion, Pauline. I thought we'd start a group of nurses whom I worked with, who could get out and educate the public in regards to more donors and letting the public know how they could donate. We approached the Kidney Foundation and we became very involved in the chapter. And Freda was on the board at the time, and what was the president? He was a lawyer.
Judge Kieran's?
Oh,
Roger Kieran's.
Yes.
Roger Kieran's.
Yes, and they were very much wanting to promote organ donation. So the nurses could do the education as far as the dialysis goes and what it means for dialysis for a patient, and then we had our areas covered in the legal side of it with Judge Kearns, and it was very, very exciting. It was in those days that we got the organ donation card. They were doing more transplants in Toronto. They had a procurement program in Toronto called the Metro Organ Retrieval and Exchange Program, which the acronym was MORE. Dr. John Doster wanted to start the organ procurement program, and he already had the name. He knew what he was going to call it. He was going to call it HOPE, Human Organ Procurement and Exchange Program. And it was sort of in concert with the MORE program. We put the two together. It was really quite quirky at the time, but it was more hope for dialysis patients. We even actually lobbied. We knew where Gordon Manili lived, and he was actually the Minister of Health at the time. And we needed money for this program. The hospital didn't have any money to give us. That's fine. So we thought we'll get it through the government. Yvonne and I, both good-looking girls at that time, we actually went to Gordon Manili outside his apartment and met with him and said, you know, we need money for this program. Can you help us? And we did that's how we started to get the funding for the HOPE program in collaboration with the Kidney Foundation. We got $25,000 from the government and $25,000 from the Kidney Foundation. But because we had lobbied the provincial government, we had to share it with Calgary. Can you imagine? Mm-hmm. So we got the monies, and then, of course, I applied for the job. And so did other people apply for the job, or the position, we'll call it. I always remember Dr. Lakey saying to me, why would anybody ever want this job? Because it's going to be 24 hours a day. And maybe I'm crazy, but I'd love the job. Well, I got the job. And that was in 1978. I had no idea what I was going to do. You know, it was a very exciting time, and it was also a very frightening time for me, because we had to prove that this program was going to work. HOPE at that time shared the list for transplant with the whole country. So if there was a kidney in the east, in the west, didn't matter. If we couldn't use it, that's where we went to. We would phone and say, we have this. We had a phenomenal rapport with Air Canada in those days. The kidneys would be removed by our surgeons here. We put them on ice, we put them in the box. I would already be talking to Air Canada because they would go out on the red eye special, usually at 12:30, and Air Canada would actually hold that plane for us, full of passengers. Attendants would be waiting for us on the ramp there. They knew us all by name. Pauline, thank you. They'd hand the kidney over. It would go in a seat next to a passenger in the front of the plane, and it would be taken off to Toronto. Usually Toronto it would go to.
How did you pack them up in those days?
Dr. Boak has just reminded me that We didn't even have labels that said fragile kidney, human kidney. We didn't want them bruised. They were actually in several plastic bags in slush, and then they were in a cardboard box. Now, this was really advancement because someone in the university hospital in the printing room made fragile human kidney on labels for us that we could stick on these boxes. That's when they used to be on a seat next to a passenger. And people would just look at them and say, human kidney. But we didn't have any protocols, you know. We had the Glasgow Coma Scale to measure if you were dead or alive in the intensive care units. And that was used. Dr. Peter Allen worked very, very well with the nephrologists and the transplant surgeons. You asked the question, Ron, about who would ask the donor families. Well, it was very mismatched. But then when I got the position, it became my responsibility. And it was wonderful. I was quite well known in the university. I think quite well known in many operating rooms. Dr. Boak, you wouldn't know this. What did you used to say? Is the slush ready, Pauline? That's when the kidneys would come out. We put the kidneys on slush to cool them down. When if the slush wasn't working, it was never anybody else's fault except mine. Pauline, Dr. Boak would say, it's your fault. But it was just by luck that the slush would work, wouldn't it? When we first started the HOPE program, I would ask for donation for cornea and kidney. And as the program became more visible in the university, within those first 5 years, we were being asked for skin for the burns unit. We were being asked for bone from the orthopedic surgeons. We were being asked uterine when she started her CMV studies. We would ask us to get blood from the donor so we compare it to the recipients. We were, the pancreas, Ray Rajot. You know, we were doing, I say we, I was part of this. We were doing pancreatic bench research with Ray Rajot and Garth Warnock.
The phone used to ring and my wife would say, it's Pauline. At least the next 48 hours we were tied down. In those days we did have a pager, but nobody heard of a cell phone, so you had to be beside a phone no matter where you go. You couldn't go to the hockey rink to watch your kids play hockey.
I actually live in St. Albert, and I knew where every phone box was on my way home because we just had the pager, and I always had quarters. That's what the days you could put a quarter in the phone, but I often would, you know, make calls from the phone box on Grote Road or the phone box just higher up. And yeah, that's all we had. And in fact, the first cell that we had in the HOPE program was a brick.
They're big.
They were big. Yeah, they were big. Receptionists, telephone receptionists at the hospital in those days were absolutely paramount to the success of the HOPE program. They knew about it, they protected me, they would hold calls for me, they were just wonderful. We will find her, we will get her. You know, they don't worry about it, she's around somewhere. But during my time with the HOPE program, we came from kidneys and cornea right up to the major organs, as they call them. And of course, there's no more of a major organ for me than the kidney. But that's when I left the program, when it was well established.
We're welcoming Phil Halloran. You came to the university, I believe, in '87, so it was
Tornado.
It was a tornado that blew him in. Can you tell us a bit about your background and your involvement? You're recognized internationally as a leader in immune suppression.
Well, I was a kid, one of 8 children in the north end of Hamilton. I went to the University of Toronto for medical school and afterwards did my internal medicine. But during medical school, I remember I was about 22 or 23, but I remember seeing a boy my age on the ward dying of renal failure, and it really made an impression on me. I knew from my teachers, like Doug Wilson, who was subsequently the dean here, that there were possibilities for looking after people like this, and it seemed that this was an area of medicine where you could really make a difference. There was a need, and there was an opportunity. And really in medicine and in healthcare, that's really what turns on young people. I did a PhD in England and became aware of the things that were going on in the United States and Europe and tried to retain those connections. So I went back to Toronto and was working in the transplant program there, trying to establish both a research program and a clinical program. My professor said, I want you to be a clinical leader that people will go to, and I want you to be a successful scientist that people will go to. I want you to be both. And well, as I was struggling with the science part, I came across a mid-career person called John Dossiter. He had founded the Kidney Foundation. The Kidney Foundation gave me some grant support, which I don't think my career would have gone anywhere without the Kidney Foundation. And John Dossiter had moved to Edmonton. So it's sort of becoming aware that Edmonton was a place where things were happening and things could happen. By about 1986, there were some brilliant people working in Alberta. Premier Lougheed was an outstanding Canadian, and he had a vision, I think, for Alberta. He recognized that in order to build a center of excellence, you had to have not just your own good people, but you had to go after other good people. You had to go after other people's people. And that's what he did for Alberta. He brought in people from other centers. And Garner King phoned me and said, would you like to come to Edmonton? And I said, no, thanks. And then he phoned again and again. And eventually I came out and looked at this place and I realized there's something special going on here. And the specialness was the people and the spirit. The administration was supportive, and this place had made itself a center of excellence in transplantation. And to this day, among all the programs in the university, transplantation is the only part of the Faculty of Medicine which is rated in the top 5 things in the university. And so this spirit that went back to 1962 and 1967 to Lionel McLeod and Bill Lakey and Ray Yulin transcended the decades. So in '87, it seemed like this was a place that you could do things, that you could make a difference for people, and both in science and in clinical care, that the administration was supportive. And then to my surprise, actual shock, the other people in my laboratory all came to me and said, we'd like to go to Edmonton. And then that made it possible, because with my research, I couldn't have done this by myself. So Sandra Cofield and Joan Urmson, Vito Ramasar, they said to me, we will move the laboratory operation. And Sandra said, well, and I'll help with the clinical programs. There were problems in patient preparation, and so we established the transplant office, and we established sort of an air traffic control center to look after all the transplant patients, the ones who were being prepared, the ones that were now 40 years out, but everyone needed a coordinated response to their needs. And we needed to recognize when they were in trouble and get them out of trouble. Darlene Conduck was the first to come into the transplant office. The clinical trials were ongoing. There was a lot of investment in the drugs, and we wanted to be part of that, so we established a clinical trials program, and Edmonton was able to play a big role in the clinical trials. And we could build our reputation in the United States, and that gave us an opportunity when they allowed us to establish the American Journal of Transplantation here in little Fort Edmonton to be able to run the world's leading transplant journal. And that was really because the team here had established itself as really being a serious place. And the chemistry among the people here, the extended role nurses, the technicians, the docs, the physicians, the surgeons, and the administration and the government, everything was coming together here to create a center of excellence. And the world was recognizing us. So then let's just fast forward now to where we are and think about the Lionel McLeods and the Ray Yulins of 1962, the Bill Lakeys. What would that spirit of young people who felt they could do anything, who felt they could solve people's problems, what would they do now as they saw the universe as it stands? What would the extended role nurses who are now 25 years old, how would they be challenged and activated and stimulated by the environment? How could we empower people to do what people did 50 years ago, what we did 30 years ago? Let's do it again. and let's have a look at where we are in relationship to the unmet needs of 1 million people in the world, how we can help people here, and how we can teach people in every other center to make people better. The dean had asked me to establish a research center. We looked across the world and we saw some technologies that were emerging that could be applied to understanding disease states. And I did a mini sabbatical at the Hammersmith in England, where I started to learn some of the science behind this. And this allowed us to identify genomics, especially the measurement of gene expression in tissues. And that had been a long career passion for me, is understanding what happens in the tissues of people with diseases. So we established a center to do this. The private investors would come in and they'd build the machines, they'd get better membranes. Then they invested in immunosuppression, and we had a generation of investment in immunosuppression. It was one of the most heavily invested areas in all of the pharmaceutical world. It was a very good area to be in for industry, and the patients all benefited. We could control immunologic events, rejection much better. But now we're trying to get investment again. So we need a better set of immunosuppressive drugs that gives people more stability. But in addition, a lot of people, despite the drugs, get in trouble, especially with a disease that we found here, which is antibody-mediated rejection. And the reason we found it is we follow patients here. This is, if you look on the map of the world, Edmonton is a pretty isolated place, and so people we transplant here tend to be followed here. And then this has emerged as probably the #1 cause of graft loss in all of transplantation, and probably for all the organs. And the individual problems need to be addressed with new science. And one after another, as you go through it, the problems of infection, the problems of cancer, the problems of antibody-mediated rejection. They're sitting there waiting for the next generation of people, including ourselves. But these teams, like the Edmonton team, has done it before, and we can take on some of these problems and make a difference.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for sharing a reflection of the past and your involvement in 50 years of transplantation. Thank you.